important to take all that with a grain of salt. Let me, I'm going to share just a couple of slides here. Let's see, here we go. I think like the most important thing, and this has been said lots of times, but it's worth reiterating, that like the most important thing is getting COVID-19 under control. And I think, you know, 6 months ago when we had good news about vaccines being approved that were effective, I think a lot of people were very hopeful that the corner was starting to be turned. And I think the explosion of cases we've seen in India over the past few weeks, and here I'm just showing on the slide like global COVID cases worldwide are sort of higher than they have ever been, has been sobering for me, that we're not out of the woods. You know, I think from the beginning, this has been the most important thing. And we have a lot of good news about the vaccine and about being able to get cases under control, but there's still a distance to go. So that's like number one thing in terms of like what's going to help the economy. Getting the root sort of cause of the recession under control is what's going to matter the most. In terms of outlook, I think there is potentially a lot of good news. You know, if you look at, if you look at like what professional forecasters are saying, like the IMF, for example, predicts GDP growth to be 6% this year, 4.4% the next year. I think a lot of professional forecasters are kind of feeling like we've turned the corner. PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey of CEOs. They expect economic growth is going to improve over the next 12 months. 76% predict that economic growth is going to improve over the next 12 months. That's the highest number they've had in the past 10 years between that survey. So I think a lot of people are feeling like we've probably turned the corner. But we're certainly in a global recession, I think, now. And I think, you know, it's sort of on, that's the good news side is like people feel like we're turning the corner. But I think it's also important to remember that we have some distance to go, that like this has been a shock of enormous proportions, and there's still some distance to go. So I grabbed, just to give a couple of examples, a couple of data points from the US where I'm based. Here's the labor force participation rate in the United States. You see sort of before the crisis, it's pretty flat. You see this huge major shock right when the pandemic hits. That's not surprising if everything shuts down. And then a lot of people went back to work, but we still have this gap that you see, you know, sort of right here, where we still have a long distance to go to even get back to the labor force participation rate that we were in previously. So that, you know, that's true in terms of labor force participation. This is from Opportunity Insights, where they track the number of small businesses that have closed. About 33% of small businesses in the US are still closed relative to where we were before. And I think a lot of those are not coming back. I think there's going to have to be a lot of new business formation still to go. So I think it's important, while I think there will be a lot of economic growth in the next year or 2 years, there's been a huge amount of dislocation. I think that for me is a big theme. And this like large amount of dislocation is going to take some time to sort of put back together. The other thing that I'll point out really quickly is, you know, I think in a normal recession, what you see is a lot of people cutting back expenditures on things like durable goods, larger purchases, things like that. And this recession has sort of like almost been the opposite in a lot of ways, where what people have cut back on is spending on services, things like travel, hotels, restaurants, any sort of face-to-face interaction. And when people cut back on durable goods expenditures, like buying furniture or cars or things like that, like in a normal recession, there's like this pent-up demand, so that when the economy starts to pick back up again, they purchase all those things and you have a quicker recovery. Mm-hmm. It's not obvious to me that we're going to sort of see people doubling the amount of vacations they take in the next year to make up for past vacations they didn't take last year, or the amount of like restaurant meals that they consume. And so because of that, I would anticipate a somewhat slower recovery than what you might see coming out of a normal recession. So my sort of headline is, I think we will see recovery. I think we're on the verge of that. but there's a lot of dislocation that needs to get put back together. And I think on top of that, it's not obvious that it will be a really quick recovery just because of the type of recession that we've had.
Right. So the global armory of tools against supply side disruptions and shocks is very, very limited. Under reasonable scenarios, as you said, a global recession is likely. This, Professor Maital, is straight out of your recent publication, Global Economic Impact of COVID-19, summary of research. Can you please share your research with us? Perhaps I could pull up the slides, your slides.
Thank you, Sally. So I'll await your slides. Thank you for inviting me. So the question that you pose is on the slide. And I enjoyed Professor Iverson's insights. He cited IMF projections. I'll supply the table with a little bit more detail. But in general, economists are terrible macro forecasters. This global recession was an easy one to forecast. When the world goes into lockdown and global supply chains are disrupted, you're going to get a recession. So the numbers are interesting. World GDP minus 3.3%, more in the advanced countries than emerging markets. China escaped without the recession. The recovery, according to IMF, is very optimistic, 6% world growth. Some projections are more. The World Bank is a bit less. There's a huge fog of uncertainty surrounding 2021 and 2022. Some think we're going to bounce back very quickly. People go back to catch up with their consumption spending. Others are more pessimistic, and it all depends on the vaccine scenario, which I'll speak about in a moment. Sally, next slide, please. So I want to make four very quick points. When the pandemic broke out, there was a feeling that globalization, the global movement, mobility of goods, people, ideas, startups, businesses, everything. There was a feeling that globalization is the problem because it enabled the virus to spread from one place, Wuhan, to the whole world. And so there's a lot of negative feeling about globalization, but we need to understand globalism is the solution, not the problem. We have a global pandemic, and if the virus is rampant in one country, Africa or India or any place, then we haven't solved the problem, and it will continue to spread. So we need to rebuild our global feeling. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, July 1944, in Vermont, in the United States, New Hampshire, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. That conference brought people together and rebuilt the world economy with the IMF and the World Bank and General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We need a new Bretton Woods conference to rebuild our globalism because it's the solution, not the problem. The second point is I'm somewhat embarrassed in presenting the GDP numbers that you saw previously. Keynes was one of the inventors of GDP, and it had a very clear focused purpose, but it's a very poor measure of well-being. And I'm embarrassed to present the numbers because it doesn't begin to show the depth of the suffering of people in my country and all over the world. I wrote an essay called GDP, Gross Domestic Problem, because it's not a measure of human well-being, and that, after all, is our goal as economists. The third point is that democracies have done poorly in handling this pandemic. By the way, so have autocracies like Russia and maybe Brazil, although China is definitely an autocracy and they've done rather well. Democracies seem to lack the discipline that it takes to get people to agree to a prolonged lockdown, and some democracies have emerged prematurely from the lockdown as we engage in this terrible race between the mutating virus and our desperate attempt to vaccinate against it. So democracy has been one of the casualties, not just the economy. My last point is that I'm really curious and concerned about our mindset as we go back to normal. Are we going back to the same old stuff, the good old days, which weren't that good, actually? We had a great many endemic problems. Or will we adopt the slogan of Build Back Better. Let's fix all those things that need fixing. That, by the way, was a political slogan of the Biden campaign. And it originated actually with a United Nations report after the tsunami and about how to rebuild. We need to build back better, not as a political slogan, but to fix all the things that made the pandemic so much more terrible and impactful. So that's my view, and up to this point, Sally.
So one of the elements for recovering and doing so as quickly as possible are vaccinations, and you just mentioned about it. Rollout is well in motion in different countries, but at the same time there is this reviews of very rare events of blood clots associated with AstraZeneca and then Covishield and Janssen, and then there are the cases of recurrence of viruses in patients who have already had COVID, and also new cases are emerging amongst people who've been fully vaccinated. So there is still relatively much that is still kind of unknown. And I'm assuming this causes a tremendous uncertainty in predictions. My question, Professor Maital, is how do vaccines factor in your predictions or projections?
So next slide, Sally, please. Yeah. So this is your interesting question and my answer, slide 4, thank you. So in the 1600s, 1623, a British poet named John Donne wrote the following, and I'm going to read the whole thing. It was quoted by Hemingway in his book, his famous novel. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the lessee, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manner of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Next slide, please, Sally. So before I talk about Israel, I must refer to India's tragedy. I'm very fond of India. I've taught there, visited India often. I have very good friends in India, and the way things unfold in India is beyond belief. Is a human tragedy of proportions that we can barely understand. So looking at the numbers, this comes from a health policy think tank. 53% of all purchased coronavirus doses of vaccine have been bought by the wealthy countries that account for only 16% of the global population. And India is particularly tragic because India is the world's major producer of vaccines. And yet the death toll is enormous, and it's far higher in practice than the numbers actually show. So that's why I'm rather embarrassed to show you the numbers for my country, because of the extent of the terrible suffering in other countries. Next slide, please, Sally. So Israel has cooked up a deal with Pfizer, and the deal was that Pfizer would send us enough vaccine doses to vaccinate the whole population, and we in turn would give Pfizer all of our data, which we have easily accessible because our vaccines were administered by large health maintenance organizations that have very advanced IT systems. And we can provide that data accurately and quickly, and we have provided to Pfizer. We are a kind of a test bed for Pfizer's vaccine. And the numbers are that most of our population has been vaccinated, at least one shot. We have 0 COVID deaths daily. Very, very few new cases daily, 15 per million. People 60 and over, almost all have been vaccinated. Our restaurants and theaters and schools are open. My wife and I went to the theater this week. We had people sitting around us. So the vaccine works. It works when you get to 60, 70% of the population. It's a massive campaign to do it. We did it by opening stadiums. My wife and I were vaccinated in December. We got our appointment on a website, got in our car, drove to the stadium, And without getting out of the car, I presented my arm and got my jab in the car, showing a card, and it was all recorded, and a green vaccine passport was sent out. So it takes some organization. So the question you asked previously, Sally, about the projection, it's based on predicting a race. We are now in an incredible race between vaccinating the world, not just Israel, the world, and this incredible vaccine, which is not even alive, which is mutating all the time and becoming more virulent and more dangerous. And it's not clear who is going to win the race. But the hope is that the vaccine itself will win the race. Dr. Fauci, the American expert virologist, we all want normalcy. The highway to that normalcy is vaccination. It's quite incredible that there is a very large group of intelligent people who find all kinds of reasons to oppose vaccination. And this is proving a problem in America, where millions of doses have been administered, 4 million a day. But a large part of the population simply refuses to be vaccinated for all kinds of reasons. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Professor Maital, I'm going to stop sharing your slides because I want to hop to Professor Michie and ask him a question. So Professor Michie, a big macroeconomic development that is a part of the forecasts is sovereign debt loads. Since last year, we've had unprecedented levels of government spendings around the world, enormous amounts of money driving up the debt levels in order to support their economies and in particular support jobs. Will deficit spending have serious consequences, including inflation and currency market collapse? I'm sure you have some thoughts on what we can do about this increase in debt levels, its effects on recovery, and how much is too much spending?
I would say in terms of what's spent in response to the global crisis, no amount is too much. You know, whatever needs to be spent needs to be spent. There's then the question later about what you do about it. You know, how you spend that debt back. You know, over time. But this does need to be seen in world historic sense. This is, you know, one of the biggest crises that have ever hit us, you know, historically. You know, it's in line with the two world wars, and it's hard to think about any other parallel. And obviously the global financial crisis 10 years ago was serious, but nothing like this. So it's got to be seen in that context. So it's a massive one-off hit, which couldn't possibly be dealt with in 1 year in terms of spending or anything. It has to be dealt with by spending which doesn't have taxation behind it. Debt goes up, and then you think how to spend it down, which is what happened in the world wars. And one way to think about it is the opposite. If someone came along and gave you a $1 trillion gift, a gift of $1 trillion, you know, what would you do? Would you go out and spend $1 trillion all at once? Well, it wouldn't be sensible to do that. Much better to put in an endowment and then just spend the income from that, which would be huge, you know, every year. So it's a bit like the opposite of that. We've had this huge hit that should be taken in the form of increased debt and then paid off over maybe 20, 30, 50, 100 years. Might sound like a long time, but actually my university just borrowed a lot of money issuing a bond for 100 years. I should add quickly that we used part of that bond to invest ourselves, to reaccumulate, to spend it, to repay the debt in 100 years. We have planned ahead, but it's that sort of time scale we should think about. So in terms of immediate spending, whatever needs to be spent, you know, in India or elsewhere, that's got to be spent. That will result in a big increase in debt, and then that needs to be paid off over time. In terms of how that's paid off over time, I say there's two things. There's obviously taxation, I'll come to last, but before that, there's the health of the economy more generally. And that's important because the danger of not borrowing enough, not spending enough, can be quite counterproductive if you thereby weaken either your economy or your society or both. You need to make sure that we come out of this, you know, build back better, or some people are saying build forward better, you know, as strong as possible as a society and economy. So we're in good shape to be able to repay the debt each year over the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years, whatever. So the important thing is to invest in activities which will have paybacks, not just next year, but 10 years, 20 years, in education, health, housing, basic productive infrastructure, innovation, and so on. So we do need to keep investing in those real productive assets. And then finally, there is tax. And actually, Joe Biden's been mentioned. He's been talking a lot recently about some huge spending commitments. I say before, talking about taxation, huge spending commitments in, firstly, investing to keep the economy and society going during COVID, but then also today talking about health, poverty, and so on. And in between, he had a huge spending commitment to infrastructure and so on. So he's now beginning to talk about paying for it, and talking about having more progressive taxation system, including taxation for the rich, taxation for corporates, where interestingly he picked up on the globalization point and said there should be a global effort to try and make sure companies, Google and the rest, are paying equal amounts across the world. And actually a very important point is tax evasion and avoidance globally, which is really on a massive scale. I mean, even compared to coronavirus, the debt's being built up. It is really, over the past few years, maybe even decades, has amounted to really serious numbers in terms of the figures you're sort of talking about of debts. If we could really end, or at least go a long way towards ending tax evasion and avoidance globally, that'd be a big step forward. And of course, would be a great step forward as well in terms of rebuilding society, because these huge tax evasion, tax avoidance measures are a lot are very closely entangled with serious crime, really horrendous crime in terms of the global drugs trade, people trafficking, illegal arms trade, and so on. So there should really be a global effort at that. So to answer your question briefly, I'd say, no amount's too much now. You must do whatever's necessary to tackle the crisis. Secondly, in terms of then paying back the debt over time, make sure we've got a healthy, in every sense, healthy society, economy, and the taxation measures, particularly cutting out tax evasion, tax avoidance globally, as well as having a progressive tax system.
Right, do whatever is necessary. Professor Iverson, you've been working on bankruptcy filings in the US and analyzing the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on bankruptcy filing rates in the United States. I imagine large businesses, small businesses, and consumer experience are very different, have very different effects of the crisis. What can you share with us in terms of the implications of all of this for the economy moving forward?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I think actually some of what I have to say about this is going to dovetail pretty nicely with what Professor Michie was just saying about sort of how we sort of transferred the losses of the pandemic. So yeah, so I've been looking pretty closely at the bankruptcy situation, just because that's mostly my area of expertise. But I think that this is also going to sort of highlight a lot of what the recovery might look like. I have just a couple of pictures and graphs here that I'll share as I talk. I said at the first, actually, that, and I think Professor Maital mentioned this as well, that economists are terrible forecasters. I was one of those. 1 year ago, right now, I was looking at a graph that looks like this, where I've got the unemployment rate here in red and bankruptcy filings in blue. And of course, they're countercyclical. When we have recessions, there are more business failures, there are more individuals that file for bankruptcy, and those things sort of go up in tandem. And I was looking at this giant spike in the unemployment rate. This is just in the US, but of course, this is true sort of around the world. I was looking at this giant spike in the unemployment rate, and I was forecasting we're going to have this huge increase in bankruptcies because this is the historical relationship that we've seen, especially during the global financial crisis 10 years ago. Huge increase in bankruptcies at exactly the same time we saw a big increase in the unemployment rate. That turned out to not be true. I won't go over the specifics of these graphs, but this is just basically showing what bankruptcy filings have done in the United States relative to 2019. So think of the zero baseline here is 2019 levels, And consumer bankruptcies you see sort of right in the middle of March when the crisis started to really take hold here in the US. Huge drop in the number of consumer bankruptcies. Same thing happened for business bankruptcies. They declined in this recession rather than increased, which is contrary to sort of anything that we've sort of seen before. And, you know, a lot of people are wondering sort of why, what's going on? Like, how is it possible that we shut down the economy and bankruptcy filings fall rather than increase? When cash flows dry up, people run out of money and they have to file for bankruptcy. That's just sort of what happens. And how did we have the reverse happen this time? You know, and I'll get to reasons for that in just a second, but you asked, Sally, you said, like, clearly how the pandemic affects sort of consumers, small businesses and large businesses is very different. And that's exactly true. In fact, let me just sort of show what happens for small business bankruptcies versus large business bankruptcies. Small businesses on the left dropped pretty much immediately and stayed below 2019 levels throughout the end of the year. And I'll just point out, 2019 was actually an incredibly good year in terms of the economic conditions. So dropping below 2019 levels means we're well below sort of like a regular rate of bankruptcies. So small businesses dropped and stable. Large businesses have been pretty much the same as 2019. And in fact, firms with over $50 million in assets, those bankruptcies are up 25% this year, while all other bankruptcies are low. So why is this going on, and what does that tell us about what the recovery might look like? I think that's kind of where I want to go. I think they're down mostly because of forbearance. Lenders have been incredibly lenient, either because of federal mandates, you know, for example, foreclosure moratoria. We've had moratoria on evictions so that we're not kicking people out of their homes during a pandemic when they don't have anywhere safe to go. I think that's kind of the biggest reason why we've seen bankruptcies go down. If no one's forcing you to repay your debt, then you're not going to have to file for bankruptcy. And this is where I sort of want to dovetail back into what Professor Michie was saying a few minutes ago. Basically, what, you know, by increasing government spending, we're taking losses that we're incurring now and pushing the payment for those sometime in the future, which I agree with him is exactly the right thing to do. We're going to spread out the payment for those losses over the future. The bankruptcy system, in a large degree, has done a similar thing. We've kicked the can down the road by increasing lender forbearance so that we're not forcing businesses to shut down. We're not forcing individuals to sort of repay their loans right now. But at some point, you know, we're going to have to sort of start to repay those losses. And we're going to have to figure out which businesses are still viable and which ones are not. And the ones that are not are going to need to restructure, maybe dissolve, and we form new businesses. And at some point, that's going to have to happen. I think it's been the right thing to sort of hit pause on the economy, but it's going to be very interesting to think about, I think, how we do that, how we come out of that, what policies should come into play when people need to start repaying their loans. You know, so like, let me just give one really quick example. Think about an individual who has had forbearance for 12 months on their mortgage. We can't sort of lift that forbearance and expect them to repay 12 months of unpaid mortgage bills all at once when they haven't been working or had much income over the past 12 months either. That's not going to work. That would just immediately force a bunch of people into bankruptcy at that time. And we, rather than having the spike at the start of the crisis, would have a spike sort of in the next 6 months or something in bankruptcies or foreclosure rates or sort of all of these like distress measures that you might expect to see. So how lenders sort of reschedule debt, I think, is going to have a pretty big impact on what the recovery might look like. If we just sort of push that all right back onto the businesses and the consumers who have had forbearance for the past 12 months, you'll have a huge amount of debt overhang, and it's hard to get out from underneath that. And I think sort of bankruptcies are sort of the canary in the coal mine. Seeing those things drop is sort of a signal of like what's been going on to allow the economy to sort of limp along as it has, and how we come out of that, I think, will depend a lot on federal policies and lender policies and how they sort take up that slack.
Right. And before talking about kind of key priorities with you, Professor Iverson, I want to switch to Professor Jonathan Michie to talk about the wealth gap. So economic recessions and depressions is an inevitable catalyst to an increase in the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. Will the aftermath of COVID-19 affect the wealth gap due to loss of jobs or the impending economic recession? What are your thoughts, Professor Michie, on how this will affect the diverging gap between the haves and the have-nots?
Yes, I think you're right that there is potentially a very serious problem emerging along those lines of increased inequality. But I'm hopeful that there's also a possibility. The situation's so bad, it may lead to a realization that something has to be done, which may turn it round. Because firstly, we've got to realize that unfortunately, we were starting from quite a low base in terms of problems of inequality and so on, because there have been problems of growing inequality for 20 or 30 years. And that was part of the reason, at least, for the global financial crisis of 2000, 2008, which led to the world's first global recession since the 1930s, with a lot of people whose incomes had stagnated for 10 years or more, taking on debts to buy houses they couldn't afford. And at the other end of the spectrum, a new class of global sort of super wealthy who were pushing for more and more fanciful financial products to give more and more ridiculous returns.
Right.
Some of which were conjured up from various schemes, and some very wealthy dealers ending up in prison when it was discovered that these were really just fictitious ways of making more and more money for the very wealthy. So we were coming from already a weak position, and the inequalities of income, wealth, and health were tragically exposed actually by COVID. Certainly in Britain, it's quite stark where the highest death rates have been in the poor areas, poor housing, people forced to crowded in, doing the jobs on the buses and the health service where they have to come into contact with lots of other people, not being able to have jobs like this, doing Zoom calls from home. So there is a problem, and unfortunately so far it has got worse during the pandemic. The very wealthy have taken opportunities to make themselves even more wealthy. So I think there's a real global imperative, social, political, health-wise, to try to bring about social sustainability as well as environmental sustainability, where social sustainability has to include health equality as well as the avoidance of increased inequality of income and wealth as well. How to do that is a difficult question, but that is one of the benefits of major world historic crises. It raises the possibilities, such as Professor Maital was referring to the Bretton Woods conference. No one would have imagined in the 1930s, with the hostile governments around the world, they could have possibly come together at Bretton Woods and designed a collaborative, cooperative, global scheme, invented the World Bank and the International Money Fund to invest, including in developing countries, to try and increase global cooperation over decades, which worked to an extent. It was the crisis of the Second World War that led to that. So I'm hopeful that that the extent of the crisis will lead to electorates, governments, others across the world to realize that we really do need a shift. In the same way as we've had shifts before, a positive shift around Bretton Woods in that era, a very negative shift, I think, in the 1980s, which led to this situation which created the global financial crisis and then made us quite susceptible to the COVID-19 crisis globally. I think that there is a possibility for a new consensus to do the things I was talking about before, which are necessary to repay the debt over decades, of ending tax evasion and avoidance on a global scale, reintroducing progressive taxation, taxing business globally so they can't just shift from one country to another. Those sort of things needs to pay off the debt, and will also actually contribute towards social sustainability as well as environmental sustainability.
Very insightful, Professor Michie, thank you. Professor Iverson, you follow developing markets and emerging economies. What would be great is to hear your thoughts and perspective about what countries can do during the relief phase, because this will have implications on the recovery and the building phase. So we touched upon history, but any lessons from history? What do you think should be the key priorities? It would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we were just talking about income inequality and wealth gaps that have been exacerbated by the crisis. And you can think about that on like a cross-country basis as well, right? And so if we think about developing economies and developing countries, I worry that sort of like that the developed countries sort of get harmed more by the pandemic than developed countries, as you know, as vaccines are more available in more developed countries or things like that. And that is certainly not what we would like to see going forward. I think for me, it's kind of helpful for me to think about breaking down the pandemic into two phases. And each country is going to go through both of these phases, but they might go through them at different times. Phase one is fighting the virus. It's when the pandemic is really set in, and when we need to sort of put an economy on pause and focus all of the efforts on fighting the virus. And I think we have some countries that are hopefully getting towards the end of that phase, like Israel, like Britain, maybe here in the US, if we can convince more people to take the vaccine. But in developing countries, I think they're, like we've seen in India and potentially in other places, they're still kind of in the thick of this phase one. And then phase two is like the restructuring phase, the building back phase, where once we have the pandemic under control, then we have to face how do we rebuild the economy, as we've been talking about today. I would say sort of key priorities are, you know, obviously phase one, don't lose sight of the goal of fighting the pandemic like we've been talking about. Also in phase one, you know, I think it is incumbent on developed countries to try to support the developing countries by sending vaccines, by providing financial support. You know, this is what the IMF and the World Bank are for, and other types of organizations like that, to try to support those. I think pausing the economy is the right thing to do during phase one, and like Professor Michie was saying, sort of whatever cost is necessary needs to be paid. And then in phase two, it's about thinking carefully about how to build back. You know, we've been talking, I just talked about, like in the US, we sort of had to pause on bankruptcies. We want to see more bankruptcies going forward, because that means we're restructuring, right? And we're sort of shutting down things that aren't working. And in developing countries, that tends to be a little bit harder because the institutions are not as fully developed, so legal systems or government systems to try to support that reallocation. So whatever can be done to help workers transition to new jobs, to help entrepreneurs start new businesses, to keep sort of the financial system functioning as well as possible, to provide the capital to allow for that reallocation, I think is important. Because one thing that is still very uncertain, but I think is certainly going to happen, is the economy is going to look different and should look different after the pandemic than it did before, in developed and developing countries. You know, people are not going to travel as much. Maybe we figured out how to work from home more, things like that. And as a result of that transition, we need workers to move to different types of jobs that are going to be more productive in whatever the new economy is going to look like. So whatever we can do to support that type of reallocation, whether that's job training programs, whether that's just supporting the financial system so that banks and other capital providers are willing to provide loans to entrepreneurs to start new businesses, whatever that looks like in a developing country, I think is what needs to happen, is supporting that reallocation. So just to kind of sum up, phase one, fight the virus, and I think developed countries need to really pitch in to support that. And then phase two, whatever we can do to support reallocation of capital and employees to new opportunities, to create this, to build back better, like President Biden said, I think is the right direction to go.
Speaking of transition and transformation, so it's obvious that the structure of the global economy is likely to change permanently, particularly considering our use of technology, international trade, and supply chains. And China is a huge part of that transformation. What trends do you see, Professor Maital, emerging in the Chinese economy that you think will be permanent?
Thank you, Sally. So please, if you could put the slide on the screen.
Sure.
Next slide, 7, please. Slide 7, back up one.
Oh, sorry.
That's it, perfect. So there's your question on the screen. I've taught quite a lot in China. My university even started a Chinese university in cooperation with China in Shantou. China is fascinating. Free market economists, and many economists are pro-free market, starting with Adam Smith. We tend to mock the Chinese 5-year plan, the old Soviet-style 5-year plan, even though any self-respecting business will have a 5-year strategic plan. Why not an economy? The Chinese have 5-year plans, and they're very good at making them happen, and they just wrote a new one. So we can sort of tell what's going to happen in China by reading the plan and by assuming that more or less they're able to implement it. The new 5-year plan in China talks about China being a moderately developed economy by 2035. That's 14 years from now, with per capita GDP of $30,000 US. That's 3 times their level now. It's about $10,000 per capita, and that implies a 7% constant annual growth rate. How are the Chinese going to do that? Next slide, please, Sally. So the Chinese have the following plan. And this is important because it has implications for the whole global economy. The Chinese are shifting from exports and investment as growth engines to internal consumption as their demand engine. This is important because in the past, after World War II, after Bretton Woods, the United States economy was the only game in town, basically. The Americans and their demand became the locomotive for growth in the whole world. Will China open its economy sufficiently so that as Chinese become wealthier and earn more, will they spend more abroad and import? And will China become a locomotive for growth, certainly in Asia? And this, we already see some signs of this, that the Chinese economy is well integrated within Asia, using offshore production as Chinese wages increase. The Chinese are determined to seek leadership in key technologies. They're going all out for technology. They just launched the first part of a space station, which is quite impressive. And they may lead the world in artificial intelligence, which is a key future technology, present technology. There's a dark side to this. The Chinese have territorial claims in the South China Sea, including areas that really don't belong to them, but belong to Vietnam and Philippines and other countries. And under Xi Jinping, they're very aggressive in pursuing these territorial claims. It's bringing them into conflict with the United States. During the Cold War, we escaped nuclear annihilation because of nuclear deterrence. 2 major powers, at least 2, who had infinite nuclear weapons and could each have destroyed the other. We escaped that. We escaped that fate. We are now moving into a period of great rivalry between the US and China. And the big question, the geopolitical $64 trillion question, is whether this will play out peacefully with peaceful competition between the US and China, or will China and the US come into military conflict with disastrous results? The trigger could well be Taiwan. The Chinese have claims on Taiwan. They claim it's part of China. America is committed to Taiwan's defense. A strategic mistake could lead to a disastrous conflict. So if you want to lose some sleep, I recommend a novel, a science fiction novel by two soldiers, by Stavridis, who's a retired admiral, and Ackerman, a retired Marine soldier. They know what they're talking about. Called 2034, a novel of the next World War, about a disastrous conflict that happens by mistake. All wars happen by mistake and miscalculation. And the US and China basically destroy each other. And India emerges as the world's dominant power by managing to stay out of the conflict. So yes, China is a key. We need to watch China closely, and the geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to stop your slides here. So we're kind of short of time, but I do have a couple of more questions. Professor Jonathan Michie, I want to talk to you about the Great Reset. The World Economic Forum's Great Reset outlines this vision for an inclusive, cohesive, and sustainable world. Its three main components include steer the market towards a fair outcomes, so taxes, regulatory, and fiscal policy to create the conditions for a stakeholder economy, ensure that investments advance shared goals such as equality and sustainability, harnessing the innovations of the fourth industrial revolution to support public goods, especially by health and social challenges. A few would argue that these are misplaced goals. I'm curious to know what your thoughts on this.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think they are the right goals. And I think they're very consistent with what all three of we speakers have been talking about the need for investment, and my points about needing to do whatever's necessary and pay down the debt later, and having social as well as environmental sustainability. I think they are the right goals. Yeah, the question is how to bring them about. I mean, the Great Reset, I should declare an interest because that was launched by the World Economic Forum along with His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales as Sustainable Market Initiative, and HRH is a fellow of my college in Oxford. But I do think it was absolutely right, the right sort of initiative, an attempt to get the sort of action we've been referring back to, the sort of historic action as with Bretton Woods in a previous era. How to actually make it happen? Well, I think that the next big point in the map is the follow-on from the Paris Climate Accord, the Glasgow meetings this November, which has been postponed for a year because of COVID. That's the chance to try to get the world governments and companies to sign up for serious implementation on environmental and social sustainability. And just last week, there was a very promising development with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero emissions, a very significant initiative. This was Mark Carney, who had been head of the Canadian Central Bank and then came to be head of the British Central Bank and is now United Nations climate lead. And he's leading this Glasgow Alliance for Financial Alliance for net zero, which brings together really serious financial players from across the world and tries to tie them into, does tie them in. If they're going to join the alliance, they have to commit to much more rigorous, sort of evidence-based, testable action than the previous such global calls, which have been much more, voluntary, if you like. So I think there is hope. I think the Great Reset, is the right direction. But we've got to all work to make sure that the Glasgow November COP conference really delivers.
Speaking of hope, at the end of February 2003, when the SARS crisis broke out and the Chinese business went into lockdown, Alibaba under Jack Ma organized the construction of its new online platform with people working from home and communicating by phone and modem. And the Alibaba's market capitalization today is $547 billion. So with the hope of wrapping up this webinar on a positive note, I'd like to hear from all three of you, if there is a silver lining to all of this.
Can I begin, Sally?
Yes, please.
So your question is brilliant because your example is right on target. In 2003, Jack Ma went into lockdown because of SARS, and all his people in Alibaba were at home. He launched the Alibaba website based on people working from home, despite the difficulty in communicating. He turned the crisis into an opportunity. If we have intelligence and goodwill and compassion, we can do that. We have to see this crisis as an opportunity. That's the start of the mindset. And if we have another Bretton Woods Global Conference and restructure the world economy, identify all the problems, get together and find mutual solutions, working together as one planet, we can leverage this crisis and create something a whole lot better than what we had. The potential is there. We just need the will to do it.
Do you have some thoughts to share on this, Professor Iverson?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that there are some silver linings to this, and you know, I like your example of Jack Ma, and it makes me think actually of some data I was looking at just a few weeks ago, that new business formations already in the U.S. and in Europe are much higher than they've ever been in the past year. New business formation, like applications for new businesses, are really high, which shows, I think, that people are responding to new opportunities and new things that are out there. The other thought that I had on this is what I would love to see, and what has been nice is that the global community has come together to fight something rather than us fighting each other, to fight the virus. And I like that idea of, I would love it if that would continue, if we could sort of view problems that we need to address together, like climate change, which we know is something coming up, or other future pandemics. And it's been amazing, right? That I think one major piece of hope is we have several workable vaccines within a year of when the crisis really hit, which is amazing. And I think that type of attitude of working together against common enemies rather than working against ourselves, I would love it if that would continue. And I think that is a huge opportunity for us going forward.
Right. Professor Michie, do you have something to add?
Yes, I think it's important to bear in mind that the world economy develops generally in whole eras, you know, historic eras of a generation or more of a project before they ran into the sands, and then another era develops. And I think now is the time for a new era. I agree completely with Professor Maital's point about Bretton Woods. That was the end of a very dysfunctional era. It led to a very successful era generally for global economic development and social development, 50s, 60s, 70s, which then led to a much more destructive era. I think now's the time for a new global era, sort of global Green New Deal, if you like, targeting environmental and social sustainability, with social sustainability including health equalities.
Professor Michie, Professor Iverson, and Professor Maital, thank you very much for your precious time and for being here with us today. This has been a very illuminating conversation, and a recording of this will be on the My Science World YouTube channel and shared across our social media channels in the coming day. So thank you very much once again for being here, and I wish you all well.
Sally, your questions were very well designed. Good for you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah,
thank you.